All right, hello everybody, and welcome to the forum. This is my 8th forum and first plenary session, so first time on the stage, yes. So I'm going to introduce our panelists here. So we have Brett Ween, who serves as Director of Writing and Entertainment Outreach for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. Drawing on his background in book publishing and improvisation, Brett helps storytellers in film, television, and social media navigate sensitive portrayals of suicide and mental health. He has collaborated with platforms like Netflix, HBO, Hulu, NBC, and Viacom CBS, using the improv ethos of Yes and to inspire thoughtful storytelling that fosters a culture of mental health awareness. We have Dr. Corbin J. Stanley, a community psychologist and researcher focused on public health and community-based approaches to suicide prevention, emphasizing equitable systems, policy change, and capacity building. As Senior Director of Impact Communication and Continuous Improvement at AFSP, Dr. Stanley leads evaluations of programs, drives organizational learning, and communicates AFSP's impact. He holds a PhD in ecological community psychology. And we have Dr. Jelsey Van Thoff, who earned a BS in biology from the University of Massachusetts Amherst before going on to Tufts University to become a veterinarian. After working in mixed animal practice, Chelsea and her family moved to DC in 2020 so she could pursue a career in policy. In 2022, the death by suicide of her late partner, Dr. Peter Tripp, spurred her to successfully advocate for improved public safety measures in DC, and she has been active in advocating for suicide prevention ever since. So with that, I will give us an intro here and then pass it on to these wonderful speakers. So this session will cover, we'll just have an overview that I'll go over, storytelling strategies led by Brett, data storytelling led by Corbin, and then Chelsea will provide us with the advocate perspective. So just one story can change the minds of many, and that story could be yours. Your expertise and your impact centers on the personal story of why you advocate for this cause. Sharing your story can really make an impact, and just one story can change the minds of many. While the data and statistics are really important, and they are, it's your personal story that can form the emotional connection that make those numbers even more meaningful, or as they say, put a face to the facts. In other words, data speaks, but stories move. By combining the objectivity and rigor of data with the power of storytelling and visualization, we help to drive understanding, inspiration, and action. For some, data can be overwhelming or scary. By telling a story, we give the numbers context and clearly communicate impact. So, why advocacy storytelling is unique, and we'll get into this a bit more, but it's the brevity and also the audience. So, often at suicide prevention-focused events, the audience is typically there because they have a connection to the cause or a related issue in public health or mental health. But here with legislators, you're coming to them, you're bringing this issue to them, and that's why it's really important to make that connection with your story. And they might not necessarily have a connection or have one on their mind. Sometimes you will learn, though, as you're talking to them, they do realize they have been impacted by mental health and suicide themselves. And then I do also just want to mention, I know Bill covered this in the pre-forum webinar, but just keep in mind that you deserve respect. You do not have to stay in a meeting if anyone's being disrespectful. You do want to be prepared. I know this can be emotional, sharing your story. So just as you are giving respect to the people you're meeting with, you deserve that respect back, and just please keep that in mind. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Brett. Brett's going to talk about storytelling on a larger level, but also storytelling for our advocacy purposes tomorrow. All right.
Good morning, advocates. Good morning. Hey, everybody. Good afternoon. Well, I wanted to, that's what's known in the comedy world as a callback. I was very inspired by Laurel's Good Morning Advocates this morning. So it's still, let's pretend it's morning. Hey, everybody. I'm so thrilled to be part of this presentation because when I first started working at AFSP 10 years ago, one of the first things I did was come to the Advocacy Forum and take meetings on the Hill with all of the other volunteer advocates like yourselves, and so it's really special for me to be here. The work is very personal to me because I lost my mom to suicide. And that's like the story of my life, was supporting her until I lost her 15 years ago. That's my life story. And one of the things I love most about my job is working with volunteers to help them share their own stories, whether it's part of AFSP's Real Stories blog or in videos or whatever it is, any type of modality, if you want. And also working with the entertainment industry to help ensure that they're telling stories involving the subject responsibly. Stories are important because they help change hearts and minds, and they raise our culture's understanding. And when it comes to public policy, you're going to have a specific call to action, and you're going to have facts and figures and statistics to bolster your case. But here's the thing. Numbers themselves can be a little amorphous and dry. So you've got to capture people's attention and make them feel the numbers so that they want to use them themselves in making your case with other stakeholders. All right. So I want you to think of story as being a framework you can use to make your audience really take in what you're trying to communicate in the most powerful, memorable way. You want people to come away feeling like they want to get involved in this cause too, because it affects all of us as human beings. So adding a storytelling element to the way you communicate impact and statistics can help get your point across much more powerfully so it resonates deeply and sticks in the person's mind. So, here's what I want to accomplish here today. I want to inspire you with a handful of storytelling techniques you can use going forward after the forum, whether you want to pitch a blog article for AFSP's blog, or you're writing something in your local paper, or you have other meetings that you're going to be in, or you're doing an interview, or you're sharing your story in a social media post or a video, anything. It could even be just a conversation you're having. That's how we help people understand and become part of this cause too. But I also realize some of you are probably anxious about your Hill meetings. And for the purpose of those meetings, your personal story might just be a sentence or two, which you can combine with what Corbin's going to share, which is going to be the data story. So, a short version of your personal story for your Hill visit may just be, and I'll use myself as an example here. Suicide prevention is really important to me because I lost my mom to suicide about 15 years ago. And since being involved with AFSP, I've learned that suicide isn't some mysterious thing that we can't do anything about. While we can't point to a specific individual and say, I'm going to stop them from taking their own life, there are things we know from research that statistically help lower the rates of suicide overall and do help to save lives. Right? And then you can get into the data story and the legislation. And these meetings really are just conversations, okay? So they might want to hear more about your personal story, so just be present and go with the flow. You're simply talking to another human being. And my big tip, and I'm not kidding, and I need to remind myself of this too, is remember to breathe. That's it, just remember to breathe. And if you even just start the person thinking about this topic in a more enlightened way, that's a win. Okay, so here's the thing. You're gonna rock your Hill meetings, all right? You've got this. You're gonna rock your Hill meetings. You got this. But I want you to forget about that just for the next few minutes and take in these storytelling concepts in just a more relaxed, immersive way. And maybe you'll use some of it in your Hill meetings. Maybe it'll just serve as inspiration for opportunities in the future. For instance, I kind of want you to eventually tell stories about your advocacy experiences because you guys are all awesome, and I want there to be more of you. I want you to inspire others to get involved too. So here are some personal storytelling tips to help inspire you. What is the opening scene? Think of it like a movie a little bit. Your story needs a main character, and if you're the one telling the story, that's you. It's great to begin your story by explaining what the problem is that you're trying to solve. And you want to do that in relationship to yourself. So I shared with you that really simple example I might use for myself, but for public policy issues, you might be able to then get more specific. So you might say, depending on your experience, obviously, you know, one of my oldest friends, a neighbor of mine, is a veteran, and he owns a firearm, as a lot of veterans do, and we've had a number of suicides among veterans in our community. And did you know that nearly 3 in 4 veteran suicides involve firearms? But research shows most people who don't have immediate access to lethal means when they're in a suicidal crisis don't end up dying by suicide. The data shows secure firearm storage actually saves lives. All right, great. But let's think of it like a movie. Visualize the specific moment you decided you needed to take action. Place your main character, you, somewhere specific. Where were you that you first heard about these deaths in your community? Did you run into your neighbor at the mailbox? What emotions did you experience? So now your audience isn't just taking in information, they're visualizing it. They're emotionally invested. So now your character, you, has a clear want. Your want or your goal is the motor driving your story. And for that want to be compelling, the stakes should be both big, use those numbers to make your case, but they should also be personal. Why is this cause, and more specifically, the task at hand, the want in your story, personal to you? For example, using myself as an example again, why do I help screenwriters tell stories about mental health safely? Well, it's because I remember being even a little kid and how even a single line in a TV show would indicate to both me and my mom how we should feel about what we were both going through involving her illness. All right? So that's the stakes were personal to me. They still are. Okay, so the motor driving your story is your personal want and the high stakes attached to it for yourself and for your community. And the meat of your story consists of the obstacles in your path. So, if you're telling a story about your advocacy efforts, maybe you set up a meeting with someone at your local hospital to talk to them about supporting mental health and suicide prevention for healthcare workers. But here's the obstacle: you're terrified of public speaking. Kind of like how I feel right now, just a little bit. And maybe you even get the feeling the person you're meeting with is against the idea. So how are you going to convince them? That's the obstacle. Make the most of whatever obstacles you can think of in your story. Treat it like it's Lawrence of Arabia or some big epic adventure. These obstacles are gold in your stories. Take a small obstacle and make it big. And remember, create visuals to put in your audience's mind. Did you sit in the car for 20 minutes, psyching yourself up before that meeting? Every step of your story, you should be painting a visual picture and assigning an emotion to it. So, for example, here's another one. You arrange to meet a firearm instructor who happens to be a veteran, and he's going to train you in how to shoot, and you're figuring you can use this as an opportunity to talk about including suicide prevention in their firearm safety practices. And the day before your lesson, you break your hand. What are you going to do? That's your obstacle. Well, you can't have the lesson, but you show up anyway just to talk with him, and it goes great. Paint the scene in your audience's mind. Describe the setting, describe the emotions that you and other people felt. That's the moment that everyone in the theater cheers. It's a moment of triumph. And then for kind of the epilogue of your story, think about how the world of your story is different than it was at the beginning. How are you or the other people in your story different? That's the real impact. So your neighborhood hospital now has better access to mental health treatment for its employees, and there's a nurse in your book club who told you she's taking advantage of it. Or your neighbor who's a veteran received a free secure firearm storage device, and so have his other veteran friends. So now that you've painted the human-focused story in your audience's mind, this is when the numbers and the data really start to mean something. You've used storytelling techniques, character, stakes, obstacles, emotions to dress the numbers up so that your audience fully takes in how meaningful they are. So, I hope these storytelling techniques have given you a little bit of inspiration on how you can share what you know in the form of a compelling story that you can then attach the data to. And now I'm going to pass the mic to Corbin, who's going to talk to you more about the data part of your story. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Brett and Taylor, for setting us all up so well. So I want to talk a little bit about how we integrate research and data into our storytelling when we're meeting with policymakers. Similar to what Brett shared, I'm also here for a very personal reason. I lost my brother to suicide. It'll be 15 years ago next week. And I found AFSP when my dad and I attended the Out of the Darkness Walk in Salt Lake City, Utah. Shout out to the Utah chapter. And then I moved to Michigan to start grad school and got involved with the Michigan chapter. Shout out to the Michigan chapter. And I joined the staff, the national staff at AFSP about 3.5 years ago. And this is I believe, my 6th time attending the Advocacy Forum. And I mention that because all of that is a part of my story. And I became a researcher and I became an evaluator because I was passionate about using data and research to create action, to create change. And we know that we can do that through policy, through the power of data, but also through the power of storytelling. And so why does data matter when we're talking about storytelling? One of those reasons is that data and research is just one of many sources of information that policymakers are using to make decisions. We, in our public policy office, work really closely with legislators to share the most recent research, the most recent data we have. We're advocating for evidence-based interventions and treatments, making sure that the legislation we advocate for is based in the research. But we know that there are a number of other things that influence what happens on the Hill. And so what a clear data story can do is help policymakers and their staffers understand what the data means, why the data is important, and what we want them to do as a result. And so that's what I'll be talking a little bit about today when it comes to data. So as Brett mentioned, and as Taylor started out describing, data helps the story to sort of come alive and to inspire action. But we need that in combination with a number of things. We need the data, we need the visuals, like the one-pagers and issue briefs you have in your packets, and then we need your story, the narrative. How does this all weave together? How does it impact their constituents, and what action do we want them to take in Congress? And so there are 3 steps I've outlined here for effective data storytelling, similar to what Brett outlined as well. The first is knowing your audience. As Taylor said, this is a very specific audience. We're talking to legislators and we're talking to legislative staffers on the Hill. And we want to make sure that our data story and the issues that we're sharing with them are relevant to their work specifically. And it helps make sure the message is clear and relevant and impactful for that audience. The next is to find the story, using a lot of those tips that Brett mentioned, finding what the data is saying and helping to weave that into your story and your why, into why you advocate. That can provide some very meaningful narrative and be very insightful for the legislators and staffers you'll be meeting with tomorrow. And the third is to visualize impact. And this is something we've done and the policy and advocacy team have done for you with the issue briefs on our website. We have a lot of visuals, we have the data, all readily available to share with policymakers and their staffers during your meetings. And this helps to make sure that the data is communicated clearly and that it's interpreted correctly as well, because we want to make sure we're not just sharing a table with a bunch of numbers in it, but we're also sharing the takeaway message from that data. I am not sure what was supposed to be on this slide. there's a graphic missing here, and I forget which visual it was in particular.
I can do like an interpretive dance.
Yeah, that'd be great. But I'll move along to this sort of graphic here, and this is sort of another idea to think about how you structure the story that you're telling when you're meeting with policymakers and their staff tomorrow. The first is the story, and so this is what is the problem you're hoping to address and how does it affect their constituents. And like Brett said, you want to center yourself in that story and talk about your experience, how you came to the cause of suicide prevention, how it affects constituents in their district and why you're here advocating for their constituents to advance suicide prevention legislation. Then you want to bring in some of the data. And this does not mean you need to read off a bunch of data points. It doesn't mean you need to be providing charts and graphs. But take 1 or 2 data points from your issue briefs, from your talking points, and weave that into your story. I'll talk in a little bit about some of the data resources that we have that you can use. And then you want to talk about the impact and who have we reached. So this varies depending on what the policy ask is, but you want to talk about the impact of the Lorna Breen Act and the people that have been reached through that service. You want to talk about the veterans that we've lost to suicide and what this bill would help to do in those communities. When you're talking about Talk Saves Lives and Let's Save Lives and bringing those to your members of Congress, talk about the impact of that program and the number of people we've trained through Talk Saves Lives and Let's Save Lives and how effective that program is. And then you move on to the solution. You've identified the story and the issue. You've talked about some of the data. Now, what is the legislative solution? Those are the policy asks that we're outlining for tomorrow. The Veterans Act, the Lorna Breen Act, and the Talk Saves Lives and Let's Save Lives Act, and how those will address the problems that you've outlined. Again, very clear talking points in the issue briefs and your materials. And then we move to the ask. What do we want them to do? We want them to co-sponsor or support the legislation. We want them to fund the legislation once it's been enacted. And if you have time to address some of the other issues we've talked about, talk about what other bills they might introduce, talk about what other things they can support, particularly as we move to the appropriations process for some of these policies. And so I talked about some of the data resources that we have at AFSP, and I broke this down into 3 sort of buckets of data that we have that is available to you. All of this is available on our website, and you can also always reach out to my team, the impact measurement team, or the public policy and advocacy team for some help in interpreting these data or finding new data. But the first type is public data, and this is the data we get from the CDC and SAMHSA and other organizations. This is the publicly available data we have about suicide rates and trends, the leading causes of death, the demographics, and the groups that are over-impacted by suicide, minoritized groups. You can visit afsp.org/stats for the most recent data. afsp.org/statefacts, that's all of the fact sheets that you got when you were at registration. All of that data comes from my team, who works with the policy team, communications, and the research team to develop those fact sheets. All of that data is also available on our website. There's an interactive dashboard at afsp.org/stats where you can look at your state's suicide rates and trends over the last several years. There's also research data. This is the data that comes from published studies, many of which AFSP has funded as the largest private funder of suicide research. This is the evidence for treatments and interventions, showing that many of the programs that we advocate for, like the Garrett Lee Smith Memorial Grant Program, for example, and the research data behind that. You can visit afsp.org/priorities. There's a lot of issue briefs that include many of the studies that show the impact of suicide in these communities and the treatments and policies and interventions that we advocate for. And afsp.org/research, where you can look at the grants that we funded, a list of all of the publications that have come out of research grants that we funded. And then there's AFSP data. So this is our internal data about the reach and impact of AFSP's programs. You can visit afsp.org/impact. That has some great highlights of how many people we've reached with our programs, the effectiveness of our programs. You can also visit afsp.org/annual report. Brett does a great job every year leading the development of our annual report, working with all of our departments and chapters to really summarize the impact that we're having as an organization. And there's a lot of great data in there that shows that we've trained over 250,000 people in Talk Saves Lives since it was developed and launched in 2015. That's incredible. We also know that since Let's Save Lives was launched in February of last year, it's reached over 2,000 people just in the first year of its rollout. We know that about 75% of people who attend a Talk Saves Lives presentation learn at least 3 new concepts from the program. So we know that we're reaching people, and we know that these programs are effective. So definitely encourage you to check out these websites for more of the data. And so this is sort of another way to think about how you're telling your story and how you're integrating data into the story you're telling during your sessions, and again, after the advocacy forum concludes and you're going back into your communities and continuing to share your story and advocating on the state and local levels as well. The first step, again, is context. Why does this matter? Why are we talking about suicide prevention? This is where you talk about your story, what brought you to suicide prevention. This is where you talk about the scope of the issue in the communities that you serve. Then we talk about the characters. This includes, as Brett said, you. This includes if you've lost a loved one to suicide, talking about the people that this impacts. The data and the research are incredibly important, but all of the data, all of the statistics represent people, they represent communities, and they represent families. And those characters are an important part of this story. Then we get to the climb. What can be done or what is being done around suicide prevention? In the case of our work tomorrow, this is the bills that we are advocating for and the specific asks that we have of Congress. This also includes all the work you're doing at the local and state level around advocacy. This is even when you're tabling at a Pride event, for example, and you're talking about the impact of AFSP's work. This is what is being done by AFSP. Then we move to consequences. What is the result? What is happening as a result of these programs? What will happen if this bill is enacted into law? You can talk about the impact of our programs. You can talk about the previous impact of the Dr. Lorna Breen Act and the work that's been done across the country on the healthcare workforce. You can talk about the success of the VA and the various programs and treatments and services available to veterans. And then the conclusion is, what does it mean? In the case of your conversations tomorrow, that's again, what is the ask? What do we want them to do? We want them to support the bill. We want them to co-sponsor the bill. We want them to fund the initiatives that we're asking for. And so this is another way to kind of think about that story arc and integrate the data into it. And so I have a couple examples here, and again, the quotes, oh, there we go, okay. This first example of story is using a public data example. So this is data that comes from the CDC and Veterans Affairs. So one example here is using your national fact sheet, your state fact sheets, and working with data that we and the policy and advocacy team have provided. This is one example of how you can simply integrate data into the wider story. Here, the suicide rate among veterans is more than 1.5 times greater than non-veteran U.S. civilian adults, and nearly 3 in 4 veteran suicides involve firearms. We know that secure firearm storage and veteran healthcare provider education can make a difference. Your support of H.R. 1987 and S. 926, directing the VA to provide firearm storage devices to veterans and provide information through a public awareness campaign can save lives. So this is just one way to quickly set the stage, incorporate some data points, and get right to the ask. Again, starting with your personal story and kind of leading into this broader point. When we talk about research data, this comes from AFSP's issue briefs and research summaries. We also have a whole catalog of research videos at afsp.org/research. And again, the policy and advocacy team, impact measurement, the research team can work with you on those stories. Here's another example. One of the most effective methods for preventing suicide is giving those in crisis time for a risk to diminish, intense impulses to pass, and someone to intervene. And research has shown that bridge barriers are particularly effective, and we'll hear a little bit more about that from Chelsea in a moment. For example, one research summary of 9 empirical studies found an 86% reduction in suicides at sites with bridge barriers. So this is just a hypothetical bill. This is just an example, but if you're in a meeting talking about bridge barriers, this is another way to bring in research data that supports that legislation. And finally, AFSP data. Chapter area directors, executive directors, and program managers can view the reach of their programs through our tracker. Just a shout out, anytime you're in the community delivering programs or attending an event, make sure you're entering that data into the tracker. That helps us know how many people we're reaching. And that's incredibly helpful for us and for you, so you can share that back with your donors, your walkers, your sponsors. Another example here, suicide is the leading cause of death in U.S. jails, impacting hundreds every year. We've reached over 7,500 corrections staff with our Talk Saves Lives corrections program, and 90% of them report increased knowledge. Again, a hypothetical bill here, if you're in a meeting where this comes up. But this is an example of how you can use AFSP-specific data in these meetings as well. And so with that, I will turn it over to Chelsea to talk a little bit about the advocate perspective and some of the work she's done on bridge barriers.
Hi, everybody. I gather a lot of us are not the biggest fans of public speaking, but so I feel very comfortable being nervous about it in front of you all. I do want to preface this by saying I know that we're focusing on my story right now, but it is clear to me that all of us in this room have a story, and all of our stories can do what my story did. Peter was a veterinarian. I'm a veterinarian. I struggled with suicide in vet school. And when I was in school, they told us at the time, I'm not sure about now, all the metrics and statistics are different, I'm finding, between different rates with different professions and different demographics. But they told us that veterinarians had the highest rate of suicide of all the professions, and now the numbers are 2 to 3 times as likely than the Gen Pop for male vets, and 3 to 4 times as likely than the Gen Pop for female vets. So I'm really encouraged by the bill that we're advocating for, all the bills. And I say all this because it enriches my story, and it just shows how important all of this is and how it all really does tie together, no matter what we're focusing on. This is Peter. He is my why. Sorry, I kind of planned this beforehand, but usually it's a little easier for me to just go with the flow on it. But my why, and what the most important thing is for all of us, is our why. On top of saving the lives of people who are in crisis, I never ever want anyone to experience the pain that we have all felt. And I know suicide loss is a unique flavor of grief that we all walk alone and together. And so even though I have my own pain, we all have our different kinds of pain, but it's not something I think any of us would wish on anyone else. And so that was the first thing. The second was more of a coping thing for me. I came to realize was I needed Peter to be there in some capacity. There's a spectrum of acceptance. So I saw adding to his legacy. I see this as adding to his legacy as a way to keep him alive. And to make sure as many people as possible knew how amazing he was. And then, honestly, a sense of control in a situation where it really smacks you in the face with how little you actually have control over in your life. And that's, it's not something that's, a bad thing per se. It's just like we can only control ourselves, and we all like to think we can control a lot more than that. And so this was my call to action, and this was a coping mechanism for me. And honestly, I think that it had to be done in my first year of grief after Peter left, because that's when I was most struggling. And that's when I think my story, not that I don't think it's convincing now, but I wasn't sleeping. So this was kind of like, I put all my energy into it. So I think that's when it had to be done. I'm a veterinarian, as I said, and I need evidence. And I immediately went to the data, and I was like, how am I going to get people to care about this? It really helped me continue to fight for it when the first council member I spoke to around it, Phil Mendelson, head of the DC City Council. I got him on the phone. I kind of ambushed him on a Facebook group live. He was not expecting me. And because he was the one leading the charge for not having the barrier for the Taft in the 80s. And he called me after, and after an hour-long conversation, he said to me, "It's just not worth it to me." And I know. It's infuriating. So, but, I'm glad he said it, because that drove me. I was like, no one's, some people, they're just not going to get why this is important. People with competing priorities, people with their finger on the button, they're not going to get why it's so important that they take their valuable dollars when everyone has all these different demands and take them and put them toward my demand, toward our demand. And so, I thought, if people aren't going to listen to my feelings, they're going to have to listen to objective data. And that's really what drove me in never backing down. People could comment what they wanted on the media articles that went out around Peter when I was advocating, but I kind of took it upon myself at the time to answer every single comment and educate people. If not us, then who, right? Like, we're the ones closest to the issue, and unfortunately, I'm convinced that we're going to be the most effective ones to get anything done. And oh God, 5 minutes. So I started with the data. Well, I started with my feelings, and I started with this story, right? Just as jumbled up too, and then I would come in with the data when people weren't convinced with the story, and I came in with how much money it was going to save the barriers, because if you don't care about feelings, if you don't care about data about preventing suicide, if you just don't care about people dying by suicide, maybe you'll care about the dollars you're going to save as a taxpayer. That's what Phil Mendelson cared about. He cared about the money. A lot of politicians, and I don't mean to, put them on blast or whatever, but a lot of politicians, they're gonna listen to the dollars. And so I learned that was very important, and I was lucky to have research that I could point to around how much one death by suicide costs the American taxpayer versus how much one barrier would cost. And create talking points. Keep it simple, stupid. I work in policy, or until recently, and that is the biggest thing. They want the least amount of words possible to get the point across. And so really one sentence talking points is going to be the most effective in getting something you want to convey to stay with a politician. Here's my why. I asked for help. I'm struck because the way we approach doing this and getting something accomplished, I was on the opposite. I went into this not knowing how to do any of this. I only came in with my story and the data. And the people I asked for help, I just kept telling people, it was just spilling out of me. And eventually, all the right people came into play, and they handled the bill. They told me what I needed to say, advocate with the mayor to insert this much money into the budget this year. I didn't know any of that. All I had was my experience, and that's all it took. Grassroots outreach, I created bumper stickers that I posted on a bunch of poles all around our neighborhood. They probably weren't responsible reporting, but they definitely got the point across around the advocacy effort, which is why I don't picture them here. And alert the press. I was going through resolutions in our neighborhood, doing the most foundational level of policy making for DC before it can get up to become a law. And one of the reporters who had caught the story and was reporting on the fact that we had 2 resolutions now was like, well, what else are you doing? And I was like, well, this is kind of it. This is what I know what to do. And he was like, no, you got to get your story out there. And that's when I turned to the media, and that's when I turned to asking people for contacts, asking my neighbors, just tracking down everyone I could to get the story in publishing, so that it wasn't just me needing this, wanting this. It was, a whole coalition amongst our entire community that was backing this now. And then, you know, IDing your champions. My champion was AFSP. In the end, I had champions and politicians who became champions, but I'm not gonna say that any politician was like gung-ho, except for Charles Allen. Once he learned about it, he was great. He was really my champion. But, you know, everyone needed convincing. And so the champion really was the data and the story. So this is just kind of, I know I'm running out of time. This is the progression. You know, I was trying to get in the papers in the beginning. It got enough notoriety that the mayor caught on. I think her scheduler told her about it, and she instructed DDOT, our Department of Transportation, to assess all of the bridges in DC for their suicide risk. And then after that, DDOT and Department of Behavioral Health and me and some of the council members who are the champions of this now started meeting on like a monthly basis to try to get things moving. And every time I just came in there and I said, when are we gonna get this money in? Like, when are we gonna put this in the budget this year? Right, so it all starts with you. Like I said, who, if not us, who? That's really what I believe. Your elevator pitch, obviously don't do what I just did, because that was way longer than any elevator pitch, but try to take some advice from these lovely people behind me. And then, you know, if you have any questions or you want inspiration, or I can help you troubleshoot ideas for your own grassroots advocacy effort, please feel free to email me at the email on the screen. Oh, and then I would be remiss as a veterinarian if I did not advocate for being kind to your veterinarian. As I said, one of the highest rates of suicide. It's a crisis, and it's close to me. And yeah, thank you very much.